So we're going to be in Genesis chapter 18 and 19 today. And as I alluded to earlier, we're going to be going through and looking at the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. This is an interesting. It's kind of it's interesting how which stories in the Bible kind of become common knowledge, right? And just across the world, and especially in our culture, if you say Sodom or Sodom and Gomorrah, people know what happened, right? They know that the city was completely destroyed by God, and so it sparked obviously lots of interest, of debate, and it is one that, you know, the easy answer is to say, well, the people were living horribly and they deserved it, right? But if we look at it through our normal human eyes, we say, man, this is a weird situation, right? You know, it's kind of like the flood situation, right? And so it is challenging for us, and we always have to remember that we're looking at this with eyes that are 4,000 years, 5,000 years removed from the event, right? So the way that we perceive the world is much different than the way that the world was perceived then. So that's part of the challenge. But also I think sometimes we focus on the wrong thing. There's also a lot that we can learn about our relationship with God and God's relationship with us through this story. So I'm going to read the first part, which is where we're going to spend a lot of our focus, and then I'm going to just kind of tell some of the story as well, not get into reading too much. But so we're going to be in chapter 18, starting in verse 16. This is actually picking up right where we left off. If you remember, there were the visitors that came to talk to Abraham, and these visitors, they were messengers from God. We don't know fully exactly right, but they're in human form, but there's clearly something powerful about them. And Abraham and Sarah recognized that. And if you remember, they've just told Abraham, this time next year, you're going to have a child. And then they're starting to leave, and this is where the story continues. So starting in chapter 18, verse 16. When the men got up to leave, they looked down towards Sodom, and Abraham walked along with them to see them on their way. Then the Lord said, shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just, so that the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised him. Then the Lord said, the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great and their sin so grievous that I will go down and see if what they have done is as bad as the outcry that has reached me. If not, I will know. The men turned away and went towards Sodom, but Abraham remained standing before the Lord. Then Abraham approached him and said, will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you really sweep it away and not spare the place for the sake of the 50 righteous people in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing, to kill the righteous with the wicked, treating the righteous and the wicked alike. Far be it from you. Will not the judge of all the earth do right? The Lord said, if I find 50 righteous people in the city of Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake. Then Abram spoke up again. Now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, though I am nothing but dust and ashes, what if a number of righteous is 5 less than 50? Will you destroy the whole city for the lack of 5 people? If I find 45 there, he said, I will not destroy it. Once again he spoke to him, what if only 40 are found there? He said, for the sake of 40, I will not do it. Then he said, may the Lord not be angry, but let me speak. What if only 30 can be found there? He answered, I will not do it if I find 30 there. Abraham said, now that I have been so bold as to speak to the Lord, what if only 20 can be found? He said, for the sake of 20, I will not destroy it. Then he said, may the Lord not be angry, but let me speak just once more. What if only 10 can be found there? He answered, for the sake of 10, I will not destroy it. When the Lord had finished speaking with Abraham, he left, and Abraham returned home. All right. Now, the rest of the story, then we're going to hit a few points. I find that fascinating, and I wanted to read that because that's a fascinating conversation. It's really interesting. We're going to get into that. So you have this conversation, and basically God listens to Abraham, and he says, yeah, we're going to make sure. Right? And so he sends his messengers down. If you remember, Abraham's nephew, Lot, has now settled in Sodom. Also, if you remember, it was probably, we don't know the time frame, but a couple years ago that Abraham gathered his men, went and actually rescued Lot and the nation, or the kingdom of Sodom, from being overtaken. So actually, God has intervened in the past on behalf of Sodom, but clearly that didn't make much of a difference. And so we see this, and so Lot is there and his family. The messengers of God go. They enter into the city, and a very odd and very disturbing encounter happens, which actually shows us why Sodom is so messed up, right? And so these messengers come. It's clear that they are there for a purpose, and the people kind of recognize that. So they go into Lot's house. They're visiting with Lot, and a mob of people come out, and they say, we send those two men out. We're going to violate them, and violate them specifically sexually, right? But it's more than that. It's the way that they were treating people that they knew that there's kind of they are messengers of God. Whether they understood exactly what they meant, but they knew that there was something about these men, and the way that they were treating guests in the place is one of the horrific things. And then the manner that they were doing it just adds to that. And so that kind of confirms what's going on in this city, right? Because it kind of encompasses the whole city. And then Lot makes sure that we know that he's not all that righteous as well, right? So he comes out, and again, we are viewing this with 5,000 years of history. But he comes out, and there's debate on what he was really trying to do here. That he was trying to save these two men, and he was offering something that he knew the mob wouldn't accept. Right? Have you ever kind of done that? You kind of offer something that you know they're not going to accept, but maybe it will lessen things. But what he offered is a little odd. He said, "Why don't I send out my two daughters, and you can have your way with them?" I think that probably really hurts a dad and daughter relationship moving forward. I would think there need to be some counseling after this. But it's just this. It is a surreal scene, right? And of course the mob actually says no. We're after them, right? Because they're the outsiders. They wanted the outsiders, and the men actually have to pull Lot back into his house, and there is a miraculous show of power that the men are blinded, and the mob is blinded. And that gives the men a chance to leave. And so they tell Lot and his family, listen, we had the number all the way down to 10. We can't find 10, and because you don't even count in the 10. But thankfully, you have connections. You're Abraham, and literally, it's the only reason I think Lot is saved is strictly his connection with Abraham. It is not because of his righteousness at all. This is, so they give Lot and his family a chance, and even that they complain about it, and it's just amazing. And so Lot and his family, some of his family, not all of his family, some stayed, and they are able to leave. And then you have the interesting scene that says that as God is destroying the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, that Lot's wife turns and looks back, and she turns into a pillar of salt, right? That's an interesting thing. In my Sunday school mind, I have this picture of a salt statue, right, that looks exactly like Lot's wife. I don't know if that was it. A lot of commentary will say that by turning and looking back, it wasn't just kind of, she kind of glanced over her shoulder, and if, no, she actually turned and went back. Like that she was not going to be able to leave that life behind. And so it's this interesting thing that we see, and one thing that is a very teachable lesson is how difficult it can be to leave corruption and to leave evil once it becomes so pervasive. Like you don't even realize you're in it, right? And it just becomes part of the culture, and that's what had happened in Sodom and Gomorrah. There was nothing really redeemable about it. They had gotten that far, and so let's kind of look at this. So what's going on? Because I think most of us, we still see that, and we see this. We see it through, again, a few thousand years. We see it through Jesus Christ coming and saying that he desires that none should perish, that all should be saved through him, right? That he's offering grace, he's offering a chance of redemption. So we see that. Well, that's the progression of this. And so it is kind of tough. You look back and you say, well, why would God do this? Yeah, they're bad people. We I think we can agree with that. But what is God doing? And I think part of it is we need to be okay with a little bit of that struggle. That conversation that Abraham has with God is very instructive for us. And that's something that was not seen. You didn't, there are lots of people who have believed in different gods and things like that, and still today, none would have ever thought that you could actually speak to a God this way, right? And Abraham, he starts off, and you can tell, he starts off, he's really calling God out. He's saying, how could you do that? You are right, and you are a just God. How could you do this, right? And Abraham is kind of speaking pretty emotionally, and you see he nearly realizes it. And so as he continues, the next time he speaks to God, he says, now I'm only but dust and ash, right? And then he continues to say, if I could be so bold, right? He realizes kind of, whoa, I'm having a really deep conversation with God who could at any moment just wipe me out, right? And but that's really instructive, right? That God is willing to have this conversation with Abraham, and God has already talked about. He said, Abraham will surely become a great and powerful nation, and all nations on earth will be blessed through him. For I have chosen him so that he will direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. So God has chosen Abraham to spread this message of doing right and of being just to the world. But the world isn't at that place. Right? And that's one of the hard things and kind of the ironic things. The reason that we look at this and we struggle is precisely because of the Judeo-Christian values that started with Abraham. Right? If God hadn't have used Abraham, and it's hard for us, and I know there's debate, but the reason that we look at this and say, wow, that's pretty harsh, is because we have a Judeo-Christian basis. Right? There are places, and you look throughout history, and it's so difficult for us to wrap our minds around, but you look throughout history, there are nations and people groups that did not value life at all. Like there was no value to it. Right? It's hard for us because now really you can make the case that the whole world today has at least been influenced somewhat by a Judeo-Christian principle. Like there are very few people who now will look at genocides and things like that and say, oh no, that's okay, right? But again, the reason that even happened is because what God did through Abraham, right? And so this is at the beginning of all of that. So this is a group of people at Sodom and Gomorrah that have gone beyond the limits of what was acceptable even during that time, right? And God still is struggling with how to kind of handle it in a way, right? He's actually talking to Abraham about this, and Abraham actually shows that he was the right guy to pick to start the people because he has sympathy for them. And it's interesting, as he's talking with God, you can nearly feel Abraham's understanding start to change, right? So his first impression is, this is horrible. Why would you do this? And then he probably starts thinking about Sodom. And he goes, well, I kind of understand, but that's still not fair. There's got to be some decent people there. So he says 50. And we don't know exactly how big Sodom was, but it's a decent-sized city. There could be cities that got well into the thousands, right? And so he says, how about just 50? Well, that percentage is tiny, right? And God was like, yeah, I would be willing to spare the whole thing for just 50 who are righteous. And then you can nearly feel as Abram's thing, he's going, probably went a little too high. Let's lower this just a little bit. Right? How about 5 less than that? Right? And God does the math in his head and responds, okay, 45. Yeah, I can do 45. And then it's interesting that the Bible actually records all of this, right? You wouldn't have to record, going down in increments of 10, but it's nearly showing that Abraham is starting to kind of understand why God is doing this and is still holding out hope that maybe there's a chance. And even God himself is saying, yeah, there is a chance if there is just one, right? And of course, we know that there was not one at all. And it's still for us is a really tough thing, but actually this was God showing again how much he detests evil and how much he detests people treating each other the way that people were treating each other in Sodom and Gomorrah, right? This was not that God was upset that the people of Sodom were not worshiping him. There is never that mentioned anywhere. God is not retaliating because they don't believe in him. And that's an interesting part of the dynamics with God. God doesn't retaliate against people because they don't believe in him. He allows that. If you don't want to believe in him, that's okay. But you're still his creation. So he still cares about you. And so when you cross over that line to basically not valuing God's creation in any way, shape, or form, at some point, God says, enough. And the reality is this is not how God works on a regular basis. He doesn't just destroy people groups, right? This is something that happened a long time ago and really hasn't been repeated, even though you have seen the more corrupt and evil groups of people become, they nearly always crumble and fall throughout history, right? But I kind of find a little bit of comfort in knowing that we have a God who, when he sees that his heart is broken as well, that he recognizes that evil, it truly is evil. And people have struggled with, well, what was the specific sin, or what was it about Sodom that God detested so much? Because and I think we all kind of are doing it selfishly because we're like, well, we don't want to do that. What? I don't want that kind of vengeance. The simple and kind of lazy answer is that they were practicing homosexual acts. All right, that's part of what was going on. That clearly was not a good thing. And we have that as evidence of how they were trying to treat the messengers, right? But that is a very, well, probably an agenda-driven reason if you narrow it down to that. And that, unfortunately, has been done, where it narrows it down, well, this is the sin that puts Sodom over the top, right? Well, that's probably not exactly the case. In fact, in Ezekiel, and we have this, up. It's Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 49. Ezekiel is talking to the people of Jerusalem and warning them about kind of the place that they are going. And so he uses Sodom as an illustration. And in verse 49 it says, "Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy. They were haughty and did detestable things before me. Therefore, I did away with them as you have seen." All right, now, that lays it out pretty clearly, kind of the general thing that was happening in Sodom, is that it was a culture that had gotten to the point where they did not value human life in any way, shape, or form. They didn't care about the poor or needy. They were arrogant. They were overfed. They did not respect life, and they did all kinds of detestable things. So that's part of it. Part of it is the acts that they were participating in, but it was more the way that they perceived life. They didn't care about life anymore. Life wasn't important. People weren't important anymore. And the evil that can be done when you get to a place where you don't value life is quite incredible. And we see it even today. We've talked about a few weeks ago some of the things that have happened in the 20th century. You talk about the Holocaust. You talk about all these things. What is at the core of those is there is an arrogance, there is a haughtiness, and you get to the point where you do not value life at all, right? Now, you may choose to value this certain sect of life, but that as general, you don't value life. And we see the effects that evil can bring. And God was making a statement back in this time that is not acceptable. And that is why Abraham needed to start a people to go and start sharing and introducing that sense of morality into the world, right? That is why God was wanting to change the world through a group of people, right? And it is so important for us to wrestle with this and be okay wrestling with it, but know also, man, God actually cares how we treat each other. God, that makes a difference to him, right? And, and as I read this, I'm struck by the fact that God cared enough about Abraham. He cared enough about the people to do everything he could before he destroyed. He was giving every opportunity, but it wasn't there for Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And trying to make parallels is ridiculous. Obviously, as I read what the sins of Sodom and Gomorrah are, I see that in a lot of societies and a lot of civilizations, right? But it is not everyone, right? I would hope that most of us strive to not be those things that were written in Ezekiel, right? But we're part of a culture that is moving fits pretty close to what's being described in Ezekiel, right? Overfed, kind of selfish, arrogant, right? That's kind of what the culture is becoming, but there are lots and lots of people who are trying to live against that culture. And God cares about that. And we have a role to play just as Abraham did. And as we close our time today, we close thinking about that relationship that Abraham had with God. And that's a relationship that we have with God. You know what? We're going to struggle with how we're going to engage the world. We're going to struggle with how do we deal with the evil that is around us. But you know what? That's part of the core of our relationship with God. In fact, the word Israel means struggle with God, right? From the beginning, God wanted this to be an actual relationship, right? An actual relationship where we are engaged with our Creator, right? And sometimes we struggle with what he's doing because we don't fully understand. But that doesn't mean that we just say, oh, well, I don't understand, so I'm done with you. No, we're in this relationship together and we're struggling forward. That is very different than the vast majority of other religions. Most other religions either don't have a relationship, or the one that we see the most often in Islam. And Islam, that the core root of that word actually means submit to God. Right? So you have Israel struggle with God, Islam submit to God. Right? Those are two very different things. Like submit to God means it doesn't matter what God does, you just do it. There's not really a relationship here. Right? But implying that there's a struggle with God means that we have a relationship with him, right? And he has called us, just as he has called Abraham, to go and share a message of hope and of forgiveness, a message of redemption, right? And there's going to be things that we don't understand. We're going to run into evil in ways that we can't even imagine. But know that you have a God who cares about that, a God who is working in the world to overcome that. And one day, he will. But until then, it's our job to continue to be that messenger, to continue to struggle with our relationship with God and move forward in following what he has called us to do and how he has called us to share his message of hope with a world that many times is moving further and further away from him. But he has called us to struggle, to engage in this world, and to share the hope that we find in him. Let's go to him in prayer.